All right, we are talking about reliable and unreliable narrators. So, when we talk about the outsiders, it's very important to discuss point of view. Now, normally when we talk about point of view, we talk about it in terms of who is telling the story. Is it first person, third person, limited, or third person omniscient? Or if we change the point of view or the perspective, how would the story change? So, an easy question in discussing the outsiders would be, how would the story change if, let's say, Dally is telling the story? So I want you to think about that for a second. If we're talking about the outsiders, okay, we know Ponyboy, his version of the story, but what would Dally's point of view look like? So if we think back to chapter one, very simplistic, okay, really easy chapter. What kind of language is Dally going to use? What kind of description of characters, like the guys in the gang, is he going to give? And ultimately, how is his version of events going to differ from Ponyboy's? So, if Ponyboy is reliable and has been telling the truth, then his story should match Dally's pretend version that we're, pretending happened. Unfortunately, we don't have any means of knowing. The other thing that's important is also if Dally was telling the story, we'd get a completely different story because Dally's not at the park when Johnny stabs Bob. Dally is, his version of what happens at the church is going to be different than Ponyboy's. Ponyboy and Johnny feel this obligation to run into the church. Dally is going to be like, nah, let the kids burn. So it's interesting in talking about point of view. It's worth the conversation of the what if Dally was telling. But ultimately, it's important to think about that because Ponyboy keeps telling us that he lies. And so that's where it's important to understand point of view because it's not only just that Ponyboy is telling the story, it's that is his version of events, or are his versions of events rather, are they accurate? And so we discussed this briefly in talking about static versus dynamic characters because a lot of you really feel that Johnny is a static character, that he hasn't changed. Or sorry, opposite of that, that he's dynamic, that he has changed. He was weak and quiet, and now he's tough and bold, or he was up until he died. Um, but the problem with that is that you are looking at it through the lens of Ponyboy. If you take a step back and don't look at it through the lens of Ponyboy, is Johnny actually static or is he dynamic? I mean, we argued, or I argued to you, that he is in fact static. He hasn't changed. He was always tough, etc. But ultimately, this brings us back to the point of Ponyboy has told us that he lies. So that even begs the question: is what he told us about Johnny even true? So, unreliable narrators are an important aspect of writing. Writers or authors who choose to write these narrations with first person narratives have to decide how truthful they think their narrator is going to be. And that brings us into this idea that there is a possibility of different kinds of unreliable narrators. There's roughly 12. We're going to talk about three general characteristics of unreliable narrators today. So, our first one are deliberately unreliable narrators. And these are narrators that lie to us, the audience. They tell us that they're lying point blank multiple times. And then we have to figure out what it is that they are telling the truth about. So you can see this in lots of films and TV shows. This is a common trope, what we call a common style of unreliable narrators. Remember, film and TV both come from scripts. So they still have to follow a plot and they still have to use the general conventions of what we've been talking about with our novel. So they still have to follow all those same rules. There have to be conflicts. There has to be that standard plot diagram, if you will, when they're coming up with an episode or a film. So think of a film as kind of the novel version and think of a television show or episode as the short story version. But they still have to follow those rules. So in a cop show, you might see a person that says they didn't commit a crime and they might be the focus of that particular episode or that film. And they might tell you the whole time they didn't do it, the people are out to get them, the cops are trying to set them up, this whole thing. But if they tell you that they're liars and they're really good at lying, you begin to question, okay, well, did they actually commit the crime then maybe? And maybe the cops are right. Is the person telling me the story actually true? Did they not commit it? Or am I being lied to? So that becomes this question. And it adds to the mystery. It honestly, if done well, is very good. But the problem is if your main character is a liar, liars are really hard to relate to. I mean, in terms of your own personal life, you don't want liars in your own life because you can't trust them. So there's a fine line, and a writer or a author has to do a very good job of making the character likable enough for you to keep reading, but also there has to be this kind of air of mystery. And so that is a very difficult task. In terms of some examples of books, Clockwork Orange is a pretty classic example. It is both a film and a book, obviously, book first. And the main character has his own language and he essentially commits all these murders and crimes. But he tells you that some of like that he lies about it, that he's good at lying. So then you start to question, is he actually lying or did he actually commit these things? Is he trying to get me as the reader to believe stuff? And that adds to the mystery and is somewhat successful. So it can be somewhat confusing sometimes reading about a deliberate and unreliable narrator. And so that's why sometimes it's not successful. So there are very few examples of what I would argue are successful examples of a deliberately unreliable character or narrator. Our second kind are evasive unreliables. They unconsciously alter the truth. Sometimes it's most likely because they're hiding the truth from themselves. Something happened to them and they don't want to deal with that yet. So they lie to themselves about what has happened so that they can cope or deal with it. This is a couple good examples might be The Life of Pi, if you saw that film, or the Perks of Being a Wallflower. Both are books and film adaptations, and both have the same kind of similar concept that the main character who's telling the story doesn't quite understand what happened in their past, kind of leaves these big pieces out, hints to us as a reader that something may have happened, but then you're not quite sure if that's what the case is. You start to wonder and pick up on things, and maybe there's more to the story. And both are great examples of how an evasive, unreliable narrator can be well done. Eventually, whatever happened is revealed, and you feel not justified that the character was justified in lying, but you understand, you relate more. So it's a little different than the deliberate liar where you have no idea why they're lying or that you know they're lying and not what's true and what not true. This type of narrator is a little more sneaky, but more from a psychological standpoint. And our final kind is the naively unreliable. A great example is Forrest Gump here. And it's the narrators that are honest and they do lie sometimes, but it's more that they lie because they don't understand what's happening. They lie without meaning to. They don't understand all the information. This happens a lot with children narrators. Um, Not to say that because children are naive or stupid or anything like that. It's more that they're in a novel that's meant for adults, but they're the narrator. So in a book like Huck Finn is grows up with this terrible home life and he runs away with a freed slave named Jim. And he is on a raft. They build a raft and escape on the Mississippi. And he has all these interactions. And he doesn't understand why people are so rude or racist to Jim, including himself. He doesn't understand the language that he uses has power, all these pieces. So he's unreliable in terms of how he relays information, but it's because it would be like if a little kid was telling a story. Ultimately, we as readers, because again, there are way more, but we're not examining them. You can Google the internet infinitely. There are tons of videos and examples of unreliable narrators and the different kinds of them. Um, but ultimately, with unreliable narrators, in terms of the outsiders, you kind of have to decide, is Ponyboy deliberately unreliable, evasively unreliable, or naively unreliable? And to look at these examples, remember, Ponyboy tells us that he lies to himself all the time. He does counter with he doesn't believe him, but at the church, he's like, I'm such a good liar. It comes so naturally when he tells the old men they're just playing army. Is he evasive, unreliable because he's experiencing an extreme trauma? Is he naively unreliable? I mean, Soda gets a letter from Sandy that says, or that, Sandy leaves because she goes to Florida, and Ponyboy's like, I don't understand, like, why would she go to Florida? So there's the naive aspects of him. There's the extreme trauma that he's clearly experienced. There's the fact that he's told us multiple times that he lies. So we are looking at a story through the lens of a character who ultimately tells us in multiple instances that he is great at lying, that he lies to himself all the time, and but also is a 14-year-old boy that has experienced exceptional trauma for someone his age. And so we as readers kind of have to start thinking about what is Ponyboy telling us that's true, and what is Ponyboy telling us that is not. So there we are.